Greetings, people. This is the Mexican American channel. You are welcome to join us. Hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet.
Have you ever heard of La Matanza? It is a disturbing piece of history untold. It is the massacre of thousands of Mexican-American men, women, and children at the turn of the last century.
One of them may have been the boy we told you about earlier this year who was lynched in Helotes. Yet historians say La Matanza isn't widely known except by the descendants of those killed. Jesse Degollado tonight speaks to a retired teacher who is refusing to forget.
As a little girl, Norma Longoria Rodriguez wondered why she didn't have a grandfather. It wasn't until she was grown that Rodriguez learned the truth. She'd asked her father why the grave markers for her grandfather, Antonio Longoria, and great-grandfather, Jesus Bazan, had different dates if they died the same day in 1915.
And he got real mad and he said, well, they did. They were killed by the Texas Rangers. I said, what?
Her mother had told her they'd been mistaken for bandidos, yet it was Antonio Longoria, a former deputy sheriff, teacher, and school board member, and his father-in-law, who had gone to Texas Rangers to report bandidos had raided their Hidalgo County ranch. As they were leaving, the Rangers drove up behind them.
Shot them dead, the back, from the Model T that they were in.
Longoria says their bodies were left to rot as a warning to others. Yet there was nothing her grandmother could do.
And she would say, ¿Para qué voy a criar más huérfanos?
Why create more orphans, she'd say. Demanding justice for her husband and her father was dangerous.
What could they do? They had been killed by law enforcement.
It's really a land grab move and a displacement of all these people.
That's part of the story depicted in an exhibit at Our Lady of the Lake. Life and Death on the Border, 1910 to 1920. Investors by the trainload from up north came to the Rio Grande Valley, now known for its rich farmland.
None of the landowners are going to sell. They've owned these lands for 300 years.
So they say government leaders called in the Texas Rangers.
Just go and get rid of all those Mexicans. And they did, or tried.
U.S. troops also were sent to the border to stop Mexican citizens fleeing the revolution there. It also didn't help. Some Mexican Americans, fed up with the violence, never realized their plan to take back Texas.
The question must be asked, what can be learned from all of this? Could history repeat itself?
Well, the thing is that history's not repeating itself. The problem has not been solved.
Given, he says, what's happening on the border lately. Despite everything, Rodriguez says her family doesn't harbor any hate or bitterness.
The only way that people can deal with something like that is to do the opposite.
Standing at the historical marker where Antonio Longoria and Jesus Bazan were killed are some of their descendants committed to public service.
Always wanting to help, always wanting to do something for the community like Jesus and Antonio had done.
Jesse Degollado, KSAT 12 News.
The Life and Death on the Border exhibit will be at Our Lady of the Lake University through the end of this month. We have a link on ksat.com to the Refusing to Forget website and its documentary about the border bandit war. So far, the Texas Rangers have not responded to our request for a statement.
La Matanza, the massacre and the hour of blood, was a period of anti-Mexican violence in Texas, including massacres and lynchings between 1910 and 1920 in the midst of tensions between the United States and Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. This violence was committed by Anglo-Texan vigilantes and law enforcement such as the Texas Rangers during operations against bandit raids known as the Bandit Wars. The Texas Rangers historically engaged in widespread violence and brutality against Mexican Americans and Mexicans. This violent period spurred what would become the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. The violence and denial of civil liberties during this period was justified by racism. Ranger violence reached its peak from 1915 to 1919 in response to increasing conflict, initially because of the plan to San Diego by Mexican and Tejano insurgents to take Texas. This period was referred to as the Hour of Blood by Mexicans in South Texas, many of whom fled to Mexico to escape the violence. Estimates for the number of Mexican Americans killed in the violence in Texas during the 1910s ranges from 300 to 5,000 killed. At least 100 Mexican Americans were lynched in the 1910s, many in Texas. Many murders were concealed and went unreported, with some in South Texas, suspected by Rangers of supporting rebels, being placed on blacklists and often disappearing. The Texas Rangers were officially founded in 1823 to protect settlers and actively drove Native American tribes from their homelands, often killing them in the process. They played a significant role in the systematic displacement of tribes like the Comanche, Apache, and Cherokee, engaging in brutal conflicts and battles such as the 1840 Battle of Plum Creek. They were established for punitive expeditions against indigenous people, specifically to stop raids by the Karankawa Indians and later to fight the Comanches. Texas leadership, backed by the Rangers, engaged in a policy of extermination of tribes in the mid-19th century. Throughout the 19th century, the Rangers served as an armed force to remove Native Americans to make way for Anglo-American settlement. The peak of La Matanza happened in 1915. In January 1915, a man named Basilio Ramos and a group of rebels, also known as segregationistas from Mexico, began to propose a plan of action to attack settlements along the Rio Grande River, known as the Plan of San Diego. A bloodshed battle began when Los Indios Ranch, a border town located in Cameron County, was targeted on July 4, 1915. Through July, several raids and attacks began to emerge on landowners. Feuds began to cause turmoil on August 8, 1915, when a large group of segregationistas ambushed a white man's ranch, where 3 men were killed and 2 were wounded. Rising tensions began to escalate between landlords and indigenous people who wanted to fight against the government's repression. The increased number of hate crimes led Mexican Americans to flee to Mexico, known as the Great Exodus. Texas Rangers falsely accused Mexican Americans of being affiliated with bandits in the Rio Grande Valley area. The lynching of 20-year-old Antonio Rodriguez sparked a revolution that led to 5 years of raging war. Rodriguez was the first victim lost to La Matanza in 1910. He was an American citizen born in New Mexico who was a ranch hand who was accused of killing the ranch owner, F.E. Henderson. A group of white Texans dragged Rodriguez out of his jail cell in Rock Springs, Texas, where they doused him in gasoline and set him ablaze. Many others were innocent victims of the racial violence imposed at the hands of Texas Rangers.
It was 1918. Mexico was still in the midst of a revolution. Texas was a battleground as violence spilled over the border. The Rangers were roughly organized. That year, on January 28th, Texas Rangers killed 15 men and boys in the tiny ranching town of Porvenir, Texas, 170 miles southeast of El Paso near Big Bend. The massacre wiped the town off the map. And according to research by former investigative reporter turned author Doug Swanson, the Rangers' behavior earned them the nickname of roving assassins.
All along the border, from the Rio Grande up to the Big Bend, to instigate a reign of terror. And that was their preferred method of operating. They killed some bad guys, but they also killed a lot of innocent people.
One of those people murdered at Porvenir was the great-grandfather of El Pasoan Arlinda Valencia. The retired high school educator learned about the massacre from a family member.
And what did your uncle tell you about what had happened?
That they had come in the middle of the night and that they'd gotten all the men in the village and that they had shot them all. And we're not just talking just shot in the head. They shot them to bits. You couldn't even recognize the parts. In fact, when they buried them, they had to bury them in a mass grave because they didn't know what part belonged to what. That's how bad they shot them up.
And there were 15 dead, ages 16 to 72. There was no reason to kill them, but the Rangers and the cavalrymen did, and then left. They were strictly after revenge, punishment maybe for some crimes that others had committed, and they left 42 children fatherless on that night.
It must have been horrific to hear that about your family.
Well, it was horrific to even think that my great-grandmother and all the other wives and children had to see that I don't see how anyone could stay sane after that.
No one was held responsible then, and now the Texas Rangers only tell me there's no relationship between the massacre and current-day Rangers. In the latest episode of my podcast, Borderland Crimes, the horrific details Valencia uncovered in her research of the massacre. Hear what Valencia is doing to make sure more Texans learn about the dark history of the Rangers. Download Borderland Crimes on kvia.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Stephanie Valle, ABC.
The Porvenir Massacre was one of a series of clashes between Mexican descent men and the Texas Rangers set off by the Mexican Revolution and accompanying events. In January 1918, the residents of Porvenir were landowners and farmers who raised livestock, grew produce, and raised their families in an arid desert climate. They were making a life in arguably the most challenging environment in Texas. In the mid-1910s, Manuel Morales, for example, owned farmland and raised cotton and successfully irrigated his crops by diverting water from the Rio Grande. Morales' irrigation system helped him expand his venture. Residents also cared about education. Harry Warren maintained a public school where local families sent their children. On January 24th, 1918, a group of Texas Rangers from Company B and local civilians visited the residents of Porvenir while they slept. The posse ordered the residents out of their beds and searched the homes and residents at gunpoint. The posse ordered the families to return home but took Roman Nieves, Nutemio Gonzalez, and Manuel Fierro as prisoners. On January 26, after 2 days of captivity, the Rangers released the residents, only to visit them again days later. In the early morning of January 28, 1918, Texas Rangers of Company B and 4 local ranchmen, Buck Poole, John Poole, Tom Snyder, and Raymond Fitzgerald, surrounded the residents of Porvenir. With the help of soldiers from the 8th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, the Rangers and cattlemen woke up the residents and separated 15 men and boys from their families and neighbors. The unarmed group was taken into custody, denied due process, and executed en masse. In the hours, days, and weeks following the massacre, the surviving families had to decide where to seek safety and where to live. The families abandoned their homes. They crossed into Mexico and received refuge and aid from Mexican troops stationed near the border. The families received permission to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones and bury them in Mexico. The massacre triggered an investigation by the Mexican government. The survivors provided sworn statements. By February 15, the Mexican embassy led a formal protest with Secretary of State Robert Lansing and asked that the State Department charge assailants with responsibility and to apply to them a well-earned punishment. Following the massacre, the Texas Rangers and the ranchmen submitted reports and statements attempting to justify the massacre. They described the residents of Porvenir as thieves, informers, spies, and murderers. They accused the victims of being suspects in a raid on the Bright Ranch a month earlier. They provided an account that suggested they came under fire from a group of unknown men hiding in the brush and that they returned gunfire in the dark. Investigations by Mexican consuls, U.S. soldiers, and the United States State Department found that the victims of Porvenir did not die in a shootout, but were killed while they were unarmed and in Texas Ranger custody. With growing federal and diplomatic pressure, the Texas governor responded to the mounting evidence. On June 4, 1918, Governor William Pettus Hobby disbanded Company B of the Texas Rangers. Jose Thomas Canales, a state representative of Texas, thought the horrific crimes of the Texas Rangers were unjust and not deserved. At the time, Jose Canales was the only Latino actively serving in the Texas legislature. In 1919, an investigation called the 1919 Canales Investigation launched a deeper insight into the Texas Rangers and their racially motivated tactics. Lawlessness, misery, and increased violence of the Chicano population motivated Canales to abolish the Texas Rangers. The Rangers were charged with 19 charges of misconduct for the retaliation of Mexican civilians. On January 15, 1919, Canales introduced House Bill 5, which aimed to reform the Texas Rangers. However, a committee run by State Representative William H. Bledsoe, formed to investigate Canales' allegations, amended the bill and introduced increased pay, changed the limit of Texas Rangers from the 24 that Canales initially proposed in time of peace to 75 members, and police professionalization. Canales refrained from voting on the amended bill, but the majority of the Texas House approved and signed it into law on March 31, 1919. Though the exact number of lives lost remains unknown, historians have estimated hundreds or perhaps thousands of lives of Mexican Americans, and Mexican citizens were killed during this brutal period. The legacy of this calamitous time in history of horrible acts was simply discrimination and racial violence. While La Matanza was a dark period of our history, it's important to note that these violent acts of discrimination continue to haunt and pose a threat to our community in the Rio Grande Valley to this very day. The Texas Rangers were an instrument of white supremacy for a significant portion of their nearly 200-year history. While their primary role was law enforcement, they operated to uphold a racial order that favored Anglo-American settlers by targeting Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Black Texans. They burned villages and slaughtered innocents. They committed war crimes, hunted runaway slaves, and murdered so many Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Founded in 1823, the Rangers initially acted as a quasi-military force to protect white land owning interests, fighting Native American tribes, and later, during the Civil War, serving as a unit in the Confederate Army. In the post-Reconstruction era and into the 20th century, the Rangers functioned as enforcers of Jim Crow laws, helping to maintain the segregationist social order. People, do you understand they've been sanitizing history? They want to tell your children this thing's never happened. Erasing white supremacy is teaching white supremacy. That's why it's important for us to put our history in proper context. And this concludes for tonight's broadcast. Until next time, family, and always remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.